In today's lesson, I'm going to be looking at the population topic, which appears in section 2 of the National 5 geography paper and is a human environments topic. In the session today, I'm going to look at two main areas of the population topic. First of all, I'll outline all of the different learning outcomes that make up this topic, and I would suggest you write these down and make some notes around these, ensuring you could answer any possible question that comes up on these learning outcomes. The second area I'm going to look at will be some past paper exam questions, and I'll use them to help you understand each of those areas in a little bit more detail, as well as showing you some approaches to answering these exam questions. Before we get started, I would just like to outline some key areas of this topic. First of all, it is a core topic. What that means is you must answer the questions that appear on the population topic. Second of all, you're more than likely going to encounter two questions in this area. Thirdly, the questions are likely to be somewhere between 4 to 6 marks. And finally, questions are likely to be a describe and possibly an explain question. And I'll talk more about how to approach those types of questions in the session later on. Let's now have a look at the learning outcomes. Now, in the first set of learning outcomes, I've grouped them under the idea of the fact that development, and that is the wealth of a nation and its development, influences the population characteristics. There are 4 learning outcomes that you can see listed here. And in the first 2, you're being asked to describe indicators, both social and economic. And an indicator is something that tells us something about a country. For example, gross domestic product in the second learning outcome means the wealth of the people in a country. And the wealth of the people in the country would be strongly related to the population of that country and how it changes. The third learning outcome is your ability to describe variations using a map that you might be presented. Describing involves giving the pattern on the map that you're given. If this is a world map, for example, you might be identifying areas of the world that have high amounts of whatever data you're presented. So for example, if it was gross domestic product or GDP, you might be identifying areas in Europe that have very high levels, and you would be giving information from the key. In the final learning outcome linked to development, you'd be looking to explain the factors that can actually influence an indicator. Now, this might be a question that's worth 4 or 5 marks, and you'd be asked to explain what could influence GDP, for example, or literacy rate. So what kind of things are happening in a country that would cause it to either be high or low. In our second set of learning outcomes, I've grouped these into being able to describe and explain patterns of, and the key idea here is population density. Now, there are 3 main areas that you need to be able to do. You need to be able to describe a pattern of population density across the world. In the other 2 learning outcomes, you need to be able to explain why some parts of the world have more people and other parts of the world have less people. So this could be physical factors. These are to do with natural factors like mountain ranges, deserts, access to the coast and the climate, and how those factors influence whether there are lots of people living in an area of the world or very few. In the final learning outcome, you might be looking at human factors like levels of development, access to technology and trade, and how those influence whether a lot of people live in that area of the world or very few do. In this next grouping of learning outcomes, we are looking at factors that influence birth and death rates. In the first 2, it's your ability to describe birth and death rates across the world. And in the next 2, it is being able to explain why birth rates and death rates vary. In the second 2 learning outcomes, we're being asked to explain why birth and death rates. Now, your knowledge here is really important. It's very likely you will use your knowledge on birth and death rates at some point in answering a population question. This might be factors that you have to explain for why birth rates are high in a country, why are people having lots of children, or why they might be low. Likewise, you might be asked to explain why death rates in a country are high or are low. In this sequence of learning outcomes, we are applying the knowledge from birth and death rates to being able to describe and explain population pyramids. And there are 3 key areas that you need to be able to address. You need to be able to describe what a population pyramid shows. And I'll show you how to do that in an example. You might be asked to compare 2 different pyramids, which might be a developing and a developed pyramid, and I'll show you how to do that later on. And finally, you may be asked to compare the changes in the population characteristics of a country over time. For example, you might get a population pyramid for Scotland in 1900, and you might get one for 2020, and be asked to compare and describe and possibly explain the changes shown in that pyramid. Our final two groupings of learning outcomes are linked around this idea of the demographic transition model, as well as the role that migration can play. The demographic transition model can be linked to a number of key learning outcomes, and this is a model which is used to describe how a population changes over time as a country economically develops. What this really means is, as a country gets wealthier, how does its population characteristics change? And the model shows us that death rates start to decline as a country gets more developed. These are then followed by birth rates, which also start to decline, and these two changes happen in what is known as stage 2 and 3. In stage 4 of a country's development, like the United Kingdom, birth and death rates are now low. The final stage, stage 5, is where a country's birth rates start to, or continue to, fall to an even lower level, and we can see that in countries like Japan and Italy. You must be able to describe how birth rates and death rates change using the model, and you must also be able to explain reasons for them changing. And you will have already done that if you've revised birth and death rates, because your knowledge of birth and death rates being high or low in different parts of the world would help you answer the second learning outcome. These next 2 points are linked to what happens when a country is either rapidly growing, and that's because its death rates are falling but its birth rates are high, and therefore it's adding a lot of people to its population. Or the second one is where people are now living a long time but no longer having children. In this first example, of learning outcome, you would need to explain the problems that might be linked to a country that has a rapidly expanding population, what we might call a youthful population. In the second example, you're looking at the typical problems that Italy and Japan, and to an extent the United Kingdom, are starting to experience because it has many old people and, relatively speaking, fewer young people. The last one is that you can explain a range of methods that we are using and other regions are using around the world, like India and China, to help reduce birth rates. Final learning outcome here is linked to migration, which does influence a population of a country, and you might be asked to describe a number of push factors that force people away from a country, or pull factors that pull people towards a country. In this first example of an exam question, you're being asked to describe in detail the difference in gross national income across the world, and you've been given a map with the key to do so. Pay attention to the number of marks. This is a 4-mark question, and therefore you should be looking to write 4 statements. It is often useful to start with an overall statement looking at the global pattern. And the global pattern shows us that in the northern regions of the world, what we might call the northern hemisphere, we can see that the gross national income is quite high. What you might then do is give an example. For example, in countries like the United States, we can see that there is over 4.93 trillion. Another good example of answering this question is to identify an area that's very low, and we can see in Africa's case that the majority of countries are under 1.06. You notice I didn't say all of Africa, because that would not be true. So I've stepped back and just said the majority. We can see in South America there is some variation. So the way I might answer that is I could say that on the western side of South America, there is under 1.06 trillion US dollars, but on the eastern side, for example, Brazil, we have over 2.75 to 4.93 trillion. As long as you have 4 statements that identify particular areas of continents or the overall global pattern that you can observe linked to the key, you'll be able to access the 4 marks to this question. In this second example, we're once again dealing with a describe in detail question, and once again it's worth 4 marks. Therefore we need to make 4 statements. The difference is we're using a graph to answer it rather than a map. But the same rules apply as the ones you're using on the map. You should be giving data. I'll show you how that works. For example, I can see that this is China, and it's age groups from 1982 to 2050. What I'm mainly going to do is focus on the change from 1982 to the end of the graph in 2050. So my first statement might look something like, the population aged over 60 has increased from 8% to 27% between 1982 and 2050. You'll notice I've given the amounts from the two main bars, and I've also identified the dates. I could add a further sentence that then says this is an increase of 19%. So all I've done is taken 8 away from 27 to come to that answer. I might then work down to the next pyramid, the next age group, and I might say the 15 to 59 age group has decreased by 1% from 58% in 1982 to 57% in 2050, which is a 1% decrease. To get a further mark, however, I might actually say that this age group increased from 58 to 67 between 1982 and 2000, before then decreasing, and I'd get another mark for pointing that out. My final mark might come from identifying the change at the bottom, where the 0 to 14 has gone from 34% decreasing to 16%. You can also pick up marks by identifying what is the biggest age group in any one of these bars. So for example, I could say that in 2050, the largest age group will be the 15 to 59 year age group. Every point I made was based on giving information from the graph and how this has changed, because that is what the question requires, to describe in detail the changes. We're now moving into explain questions. That involves us having to give reasons. We are also looking at a 6-mark question, so we're looking to give 6 reasons. The map shows us the population density of the world, and it shows us areas that have a high population density, as well as areas of the world that have a low population density. And we have to offer up 6 reasons for the variation. These reasons should refer to both physical, those are natural factors, as well as human. Let's look at areas that have a low population density. We might, for example, identify that the northern Africa, where the Sahara Desert is, has very few people because it's a desert. That is describing. To explain that, you might say a lack of water means that farming is very difficult in a desert, and therefore few people live there. We might have identified that there are very few people living up this side of South America, and that's because there is a mountain range in that area called the Andes. That is describing. We've mentioned there's mountain ranges. If we then explain that it's very difficult for people to live in large numbers where the air is thin because it's high altitude. It's also unlikely to be very much flat land for developing large cities, which also would explain why there are very few people living in mountain ranges. And you'll notice the idea of mountain ranges I've just expanded into 2 points, and therefore we'll get 2 marks. Those are 3 possible physical factors, and your teacher will have probably explored a range of other factors like climate or access to the coast or rivers. Human factors could involve levels of development or technology. For example, large numbers of people or high population densities can be found in Europe. We could explain that this is because there is a lot of technological development, people have central heated homes and are able to live there in large numbers, and also there are good transport networks, which means it's easy to trade and create wealth, which encourages population growth. And that would be a human factor. In this next example of an exam question, we are once again dealing with a version of an explain question. In this question, it says give reasons. Effectively, you're needing to explain. It is also worth 6 marks, so you'll be looking to give 6 points. This is where your knowledge of being able to explain why death rates and birth rates vary is important, because we are looking at how birth rates have changed across time. And the general idea of this question is that birth rates started high in 1901, but they've fallen to 2011. And we don't actually need to say that, because that would be a description. We are looking to give reasons for those changes. Why have they decreased? We may be looking at the fact that women have fewer families because contraception is widely used, which is slowing down the number of births. We might also look at the fact that more women are entering the workplace, especially since the 1960s, which means that they're pursuing careers and less likely to be having children. Another factor in this decrease is the fact that children are no longer seen as an economic asset. They're no longer needed to create wealth for their family or work on farms, and therefore families don't require so many children. Another factor of the fall could be because most children now survive, because infant mortality is low in Scotland today, and because very few babies are dying, women are choosing to have fewer children. A combination of the factors I've just mentioned, as well as some other factors, would allow you to access the 6 marks, and I would thoroughly recommend you revise all of the factors that cause birth and death rates to be high or low, as well as those factors that cause them to change across time. A population pyramid shows you the structure of a country's population in each of the age groups, starting from the 0 to 4 age group to the 100 plus. It also tells us the breakdown between women and men and how many are in each of those age groups. A simple question might be to describe the population characteristics of a country when you're given a graph in the question. To do that, you'd be expected to give some data from your graph and answer that question. An important part of describing a population pyramid involves you identifying an age group, taking the amount of females and males from that age group, adding them together. So in this case, we have roughly 400,000 females and we have roughly 400,000 males. That would be 800,000 people in the Netherlands in 2016 or in the 0 to 4 age group. You might then say, in contrast, in the 40 to 44 age group, there is the largest number of people at over 1.2 million. And I've got that number by adding both females and males together. As long as I made 4 points, I'm likely to be able to answer this question successfully. A second possible question is the one that we see here, where we are being asked to compare 2 pyramids. Now, the first thing you'll notice is these 2 pyramids are actually quite different. This one is quite narrow at the base, meaning there's relatively few children, wider in the middle, meaning there's more adults, and wider at the top, meaning there's more elderly. In contrast, Bolivia has a much wider base to its graph, to its pyramid, meaning there's far more children in Bolivia, and then there's progressively fewer people in the older age groups. The question is saying, explain the differences. So why are the differences? To answer that, you're really only needing to explain births and death rates. For example, I might say that the Netherlands has far fewer children because women are delaying having children because they're getting married later in life. In contrast, Bolivia has much more children because women get married at a much younger age. That's a birth rate factor that tells me why the Netherlands has relatively few people in its younger age groups compared to Bolivia. I might say that the Netherlands has more in its older age groups than Bolivia does, and there I'd be talking about life expectancy being longer in the Netherlands, and that's caused by lower death rates. So why does the Netherlands have lower death rates? I might then go and explain that the Netherlands has lower death rates because they have access to medical care which ensures that if they fall ill, they're likely to recover. I might also explain that in the Netherlands they have access to pensions. That means they can retire at a younger age, meaning they're likely to live a longer time than in Bolivia. This type of answer involves me using my knowledge on births and death rates to describe this difference. A final possible question that you may get is where the country is the same, but you have different dates. You may start with an early date in history, like 1900 or 1950, and then for a country, and then see another pyramid for that same country 40, 50, 60 years later. And when you see the 2 pyramids, the 2 graphs, just like here, they will have changed. It's likely they will have changed from a graph like Bolivia to a graph like the Netherlands. All you need to do is tell me, why are the birth rates falling? Because that's what will be happening as a country develops. But also, why are people living longer? So why are death rates also falling? And your knowledge, therefore, of birth and death rates will once again help you explain that possible question. That concludes my presentation on the population topic. Hopefully you found the outline of all the learning outcomes, as well as my descriptions and explanations of the different exam questions, useful in your preparation for your National Fire Geography exam.